All right. And I put some better than that. Which one's I put for better? Gotcha. And it just starts? Okay, so good evening, everyone. My name is Gemma Freisinger, and along with Emily, Madison, Danielle, and Valerie, I'm going to be presenting to you tonight about ethics. Now, ethics is a pretty broad topic, so hopefully we're going to be able to break it down into smaller pieces for you, with a quick start and a quick definition of ethics and its applications in professional and personal life. So what is ethics? Simply put, ethics is a series of moral guidelines that help us make our decisions. Even more simply put, ethics can just be a judgment about whether or not something is right or wrong and how that affects our decision making. Ethics is pervasive in all professional and personal lives, so unfortunately there really is no avoiding it. Even if you try to make a decision without any ethics whatsoever, someone else is going to judge your decisions by their own ethics. This is because ethics are sourced in philosophy, culture, religion, and other topics. And since no one grows up in a vacuum, everyone's exposed to some sort of culture that's going to help form their own ethical process. This is of particular interest in the legal department of your company because while morality isn't the same as legality, many things that are immoral are also illegal because our legal system tries to present a good and ethical society. Some examples of this are safe practice laws in your workplace or even child labor. So this is very important to your business and your industry because you need to know what laws are relevant in order to ensure that your ethical code of conduct, whether spoken or unspoken, isn't going to get you in any trouble, either because you're encouraging unethical behavior or because your employees understand that you are encouraging unethical behavior, even if you're not. So a good example of this in the United States is our federal laws about whistleblowers, which Danielle is going to touch on later in more detail. But what they are basically is that we have a law against retaliation against whistleblowers, which are people who draw attention to violations by a company. So if you are running a coal mine staffed by children, that is not only unethical, but it's illegal as well. And if you fire the person who points out your child-staffed coal mine, that is also both unethical and illegal. So if there are consequences for behaving unethically, why might you do it? If there are consequences for behaving unethically, why would you bother to do so? This is because, unfortunately, people are guided by things that aren't always ethical, such as their own self-interest, which can include money, fame, or other motivators, but also by biases. Since biases can be conscious or unconscious, it might be possible that you aren't realizing that your decisions are being influenced by them. The best way to combat a bias is to engage in diverse perspectives. This is why companies use a board of directors. A board of directors is a group of people who oversee a group or organization, a corporation or organization, in order to guide their decision making. One of the key roles of a board of directors is corporate governance. Corporate governance is a set of rules and processes by which a company pursues its goals. Because of this, it's important to make sure that you have a diverse board of directors so that they're able to check each other's biases. Unfortunately, there are boards of directors that are not so diverse, and this is where you wind up with things like collusion and scandal, which Danielle is again going to touch on a little later when she talks about corporate scandal. So the role of a board of directors is very important, and it's very hard to accomplish this role with only a single individual because this person is more likely to pursue their own values. So far, we've seen how ethics are very important in a professional context, but I want to tell you that they are also important in a personal context as well. Because we see that there are many legal and financial consequences that are possible if you behave unethically, but you shouldn't do something just because you might face consequences. You should do something because it is the right thing to do. And you might ask yourself, why is it important? Why we do something? Isn't the important part what we're doing? And if you do think that, then you're probably in pretty good company, because the debate between intent and impact is still pretty popular in the philosophical field. But if you allow me to, I'm going to divert from professional ethics a little bit into personal ethics in order to prove a point. So, say I'm talking to my friend, and she decides to tell me that I would look much better if I grew my hair back out and lost about 15 pounds and learned to apply makeup in a way that didn't make me look like a drunk toddler clown, and say that I find this comment to be extremely hurtful because I did. Thank you, Stephanie. So the impact of her action was pretty negative. But this is my friend Stephanie. I have known her since first grade. It's been nearly 15 years. We love each other very dearly. And everything that she said was truly coming from a place of constructive criticism. So really, she was telling me this because she truly and honestly wanted me to be able to make improvements myself. She wanted to help me. So So the intent of her action was positive. Does this change my feelings about it? Not really, because your intent can't change your impact. And similarly, your impact can't change your intent. So say after this presentation, Emily here decides to try to kill me by pushing me down the stairs because she feels that I didn't do a good enough job, but in doing so, she accidentally saved my life from the ceiling collapsing. Does that make her action ethical? No, because even though her impact is pretty positive because I'm alive still, her intent was still pretty negative because she was trying to murder me by pushing me down the stairs. So I hope these examples can explain to you that ethics is a pretty complex field and that it ties into decision making in a lot of complex ways, which I hope emphasizes how important it is to make sure you do have diverse perspectives who are able to check each part of the decision making process to make sure that everyone is on task. So for a quick recap, ethics is a series of moral decision making processes, or it's a series of moral judgments that helps inform our decision making processes. Ethics are sourced from philosophy, religion, and culture. Ethics are pervasive both in professional and personal contexts, and they are important for success in both of those contexts, such as legal success, financial success, and personal success in your relationships. As another note, it is difficult to engage in an ethical decision-making process on your own because you are prone to succeeding to your own biases. But so it is easier to engage in an ethical decision-making process with a group, such as a board of directors. But again, it is important to make sure that your board of directors has ethical goals in mind, because if they don't, this can lead to unethical decisions being made at every level of your company. I hope that going forward, you're able to understand how important ethics is in your everyday decision-making processes and how it ties in to your interactions with other people. Or at the very least, you'll be able to understand why your friend is angry when you tell her she looks like a clown. So now I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Emily Taddy, who is going to tell us a little bit about the stages of moral development.
Hi everyone. Understand what the next slide to show up. So I'm going to be talking about the stages of moral development today. They were developed by psychologist Lawrence Kohlberg, and I'll go into more detail by discussing each stage and the different levels that the stages are broken into. So as I mentioned, it was created by American psychologist Lawrence Kohlberg. These stages, he stated, are the planes of moral adequacy conceived to explain the development of moral reasoning, and I just chose one of the quotes that he's famous for. So going into these 6 stages, stage 1 is known as obedience and punishment. Stage 2 is self-interest orientation. Stage 3 is called good boy, nice girl. Stage 4 is law and order. Stage 5, social contract. And stage 6, universal ethical principles. So these stages are also broken down into 3 different levels. Stage 1 and 2 are categorized into level 1. Stage 3 and 4 are in level 2, and 5 and 6 are in level 3. The stages are pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. And I'll just explain those more in detail. So starting out with pre-conventional, it's basically when you assess the situation based off of will there be any consequences. The person is just concerned about themselves getting caught or getting in trouble. Once they've actually experienced a consequence from that behavior, they'll no longer do that action. And next, moving into stage 1, obedience and punishment. Like I was saying before, they just consider if the action is wrong and if they're going to be punished for it. And once someone understands that the behavior has consequences to it, they'll no longer do that behavior. So moving into stage 2, which is self-interest orientation. In this situation, a person will choose to do whatever is in their own best interest and not really consider the interests of other people involved in the situation. It's more so if you do something for me, then I would consider doing something for you in return. This person has like a what's in it for me ideal. So moving into the level 2, conventional, these 2 stages include that you're doing more so what everyone else is doing, more you're conforming to society's norms at this point, and you're just going to do what is acceptable by everyone else. So stage 3 is called good boy, nice girl, which is, like I said, you're just trying to gain approval from others, and you're going to do something that gains you appraisal. Whether you think it's right or wrong, it's just you're conforming to what everyone else would do in that situation. So stage 4 is law and order, which is more obvious. It's just when you follow the laws, believing that if you follow the laws, you're making that most ethical decision. Ultimately, you think that the laws or the rules in any situation is what determines if that action is right or wrong. And level 3 is called post-conventional. So you're realizing that at this point, society and the law don't have much to do with your actions, and you're ultimately responsible for your own actions, making a conscious and ethical decision. The rules aren't going to be the absolute dictators here. So moving into stage 5, which is social contract, you're imagining the other people in the situation and thinking more about their interests, not only yourself, just the general welfare of the group, and like I said, not as much of your own self-interests. And then stage 6 is the final stage, universal ethical principles, which is when laws and rules only have so much with making the final decision. Ultimately, it's all up to you, and you've created your own set of moral guidelines by this point. So you'll be able to defend your own rights and beliefs and what you think is morally right. So typically, psychologists state that as you get older, you advance through the stages. You start out as a child in stage 1 and then advance through adulthood to stage 6. But some people, like let's say, would still be in the stage of law and order, where they believe that the laws are ultimately always right, for example. So my personal example is that I work at the gym. That's why I'm in gym clothes. I have work right after this. So I work with customers every day. I have to listen to their feedback and work with the public. So in like my ethical dilemma would be if I take their feedback and report it to my manager, or if I decide like maybe I don't think what they complain about is important, or maybe it would just cause a lot of extra work for everyone else. So then in that case, I might not want to, but ethically, I should follow the manual and do what is right in this situation. Ultimately, by doing what is right for the company and the customers in this situation, it would result in happier customers, which leads to better success for the overall business. So moral development definitely plays an important role in our social interactions, like I was just saying. You just have to understand how and why individuals will make decisions based off their own beliefs as well as your own. And this theory of moral development, which I was talking about, just provides a framework for understanding how individuals go about their own moral reasoning. Ultimately, each decision you make is based up to your own morals and beliefs at this point, and you may stay in one stage, like I gave the example before of saying in the law stage, thinking that all these rules are correct, but you may advance and just create your own set of guidelines. So just I wanted to recap by mentioning all 6 stages that are broken into 3 different levels. Just remembering how you progress through the stage, starting at stage 1 and being an adult by the end of stage 6. And then I'm going to pass it on to Madison, who will talk about rational decision making.
Hey guys, so my name is Madison. I am a senior human resources management and management and entrepreneurship major. I'm going to be speaking about rational decision making and how it's an important factor for businesses because their employees need to be able to make these ethical decisions in the workplace. So up on the screen, there's the rational decision making model. So just some kind of quick steps of what you would go through when you're making an ethical decision. So identifying the problem, evaluating how we can come up with solutions for that, and then once you come up with some of those solutions, implementing it, and then deciding whether those implementations are working, and then going from there. So the first step would be identifying the problem, and this is kind of one of the most difficult steps for businesses because a lot of times when they realize there's a problem, it's kind of already happened. It's too late at that point to identify it. So maybe being able to pick out problems when they're presented is important. And once you know what the problem is, obviously brainstorming those solutions to come up with ways to fix the problem that's presented in the company. So coming up with multiple solutions is the best case scenario because oftentimes one solution may work, but it doesn't always work, and you have to kind of be able to fill in different options. So that comes next to implementation. So once you come up with a solution that you think could work, you would then implement it. And that implementation has to be monitored closely because by implementing it, you can have it work or not work for that particular problem. So evaluating, making sure that you are seeing whether that implementation has worked for your company and the employees, whatever the problem is that has presented. Because if it's not working, then you kind of have to go back a few steps and look at the other solutions that you chose, implement again, and evaluate. Kind of complete the circle over and over again. The next thing I'm going to talk about is decision biases. So oftentimes employees can have biases when making decisions and they don't even know it. Some of these are anchoring and adjustment, availability bias, escalation of commitment, fundamental attribution, overconfidence bias, and hindsight bias. So the first one I'm going to talk about is anchoring and adjustment. This occurs when individuals react to irrelevant numbers when setting financial targets. So we tend to base our estimates and decision on known anchors in the world that we're presented with. So a good example of this would be when somebody is buying a house. They tend to look at the other houses and listings in that area, and that's how they determine what's a good price for that house. So maybe a more accurate way to determine that would be having somebody come and like appraise the house and see what it's actually worth versus like just saying this is what the houses around it are worth and if that's any good. The next one will be the availability bias, which occurs when readily available information is incorrectly assessed to be more likely. So this bias is a big deal for like executives who think that they have like easy access to their own firm's performance, but not necessarily paying attention to other competitors. So like a good example of this would be eBay and Amazon. So eBay was kind of not paying much attention to what was going on in their market because at the time when Amazon swooped in, they kind of took over eBay by doing what they were doing and more. So they're renting and selling, but then they're also doing TV, movies, fast shipping, all those kinds of things that eBay wasn't. The next one is fundamental attribution error. This occurs when outcomes are attributed to personal characteristics, but undesirable outcomes are attributed to external circumstances. So an example of this is like when a student does well on a test, it's attributed to their intelligence, but when they do bad, it's the professor's fault because they didn't teach well. So an example of this is like when you're driving and somebody cuts you off, you immediately get angry at them, but when you swerve into a lane maybe and cut somebody else off, you kind of, they get mad at you, but you're like, oh, something was going on in my car, my kid in the back seat was screaming or the sun was in my eye. So you have a reason that you don't think of when it happens to them. Hindsight bias occurs when a mistake seems obvious after it's already happened. It's easy to notice a mistake once it's already happened versus, seeing it before it does happen. So the saying hindsight is 20/20. An example of this would be that happened to me. My brother went and bought a TV right before the holidays, before Black Friday. He went and bought a TV and spent all this money on it, and then Black Friday hit, and I went and bought the same TV for like half the price. So obviously hindsight is 20/20. He's looking back thinking, I don't know why I didn't wait, but at that point there was nothing he could really do about it. The next one would be escalation of commitment. So when individuals continue on a failing course of action, even when it becomes clear that it's a poor path that they're traveling down. So a big example of this would be like casinos, gambling. People think that they've already been failing, but the next game is the one. They're going to win. They're going to be more likely to take home that money. So personal story for this, for me, I worked for a chiropractor who wanted to remove himself from the business. He wanted to just kind of be the owner and let somebody else come in and be a chiropractor. So he hired this woman and she was pretty terrible. The patients hated her. She didn't really do her job well. And instead of pulling her out and putting himself back in, he kind of let her stay and they went down a bad path and the patients kind of started coming in. And lastly is overconfidence bias, which occurs when individuals think that they're more confident than logic actually presents. So this is common when CEOs think that like it worked for them in the past, so it's going to work again instead of doing the research and coming up with the data. I feel like you see this a lot in the healthcare field. So like, for example, people like Google everything like you're sick, and you're like, oh, I'm just gonna do a home remedy, or I'm gonna play Dr. Google and see what the fix is for this instead of going to the doctor and actually getting treatment from somebody who knows what they're doing. So as a recap, being able to make rational decisions within life and business is a huge part of being ethical. We're faced every day with choices that could have good or bad outcomes depending on the path you choose. So knowing all of these different biases and rational decision-making method are great tools for business professionals for their decisions in their careers. I'm gonna pass it off to Danielle.
Hi guys, my name is Danielle, and I'm going to be talking about corporate scandals. So just what they are, some examples of some fraud, the laws and organizations that help protect companies, and some infamous scandals. Okay, so a corporate scandal is a series of unethical or illegal actions performed by a person in order to increase financial gain for a company. Sometimes these crimes can go without the company's knowledge, but most of the time it is top executives who are performing this for their own financial gain. These are highly publicized, so they tend to end in corporate collapse due to bankruptcy or insolvency. So some corporate fraud are most common, like falsification of financial information, insider trade, false bankruptcies, Ponzi and pyramid schemes, tax fraud, money laundering and money wiring, bribery and racketeering, which is organized crime. So I'm going to talk a little bit about pyramid schemes and Ponzi schemes and what the difference are. So a pyramid scheme is when you have one fraudster who has a product that's overpriced or hard to sell, and they get promoters who invest their own large sums of money, and then those promoters become promoters, and those promoters become promoters, and they get their money back from finding new promoters. This isn't sustainable because eventually you'll have more recruits than you'll have money to go around. So similar is this pyramid scheme. So there's one schemer, and they're investing, or they're promising large investments of returns of investments to their investors. Woo, let me slow down. And then the initial investors start receiving their refunds. So people see that in the recruiting, and so that's similar. It'll work in a few months, but then eventually it'll collapse. So the main difference is a pyramid scheme. There's one promoter. That promoter becomes a promoter, and then finds more promoters, and it's a never-ending cycle of scammers. Versus a Ponzi scheme is one person scamming multiple people. So there have been at least about 25 major corporate scandals in the U.S., some of which were Tyco, Enron, WorldCom, and Bernard Madoff. These corporate scandals really hurt our economy, and a lot of the times they reduce the country's GDP. So I think we've all heard about Enron at this point, but I'm going to recap for those of you who haven't. So Enron was an energy company that got caught engaging in accounting fraud in 2001. The company revealed that it had been reporting higher revenues than they received since 1997, and this caused the SEC to suspend trading on Enron's share, and criminal investigations were opened by the Department of Justice. So there was the CEO, who was Kenneth Lay, and then there was Skilling, who was the COO. They were both convicted of conspiracy and fraud. Also, Skilling was convicted of insider trade, and he received 12 years in prison, whereas Lay died of a heart attack before his sentencing, but he was looking for up to 45 years in prison. In response to the Enron scandal, they did come up with the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, or SOX. This law was created in hopes of restoring investors' confidence and preventing future scandals. There's about 11 key elements, but I don't want to bother you with all the litigation, so I'm going to talk about a few of them. So the reform included the creation of the Oversight Board to oversee auditing activities. Standards were created to ensure auditions are truly independent and not subject to a conflict of interest. It requires senior executives to take responsibility for the accuracy of financial statements and tax forms. Also, the Securities and Exchange Commission now has expanded authority to censor or bar securities from acting as brokers, advertisers, or dealers. Criminal penalties now exist for white-collar crimes such as falsification of records. And lastly, the SEC can freeze unusually large transactions if they suspect there's fraud. So the consequences, if you knowingly, as a CEO or an executive, falsify your records that don't comply with SOX, you can face $1 million fine or 20 years in prison. And then if you willingly do it, you can face a $5 million fine and 20 years in So the Sox installed the Whistleblower Act, which protects employees from retaliation for those who report corporate fraud. The act prohibits companies from discharging, demoting, suspending, threatening, harassing, or discriminating against a whistleblower who provided information to an investigation. So we have Bernard Madoff. He was the founder of Bernard L. Madoff Securities, and he operated as a securities broker for the United States, and he was the former chairman of NASDAQ. He committed the largest Ponzi scheme ever in history, and he defrauded thousands of investors out of tens of billions of dollars during a duration of 17 years. He pled guilty to 11 felonies, including money laundering, perjury, falsely filing with the SEC, and fraud. He was sentenced to 150 years in prison and required to forfeit 170 million in assets. In 2013, the government did make a Madoff victim fund in hopes to return some of those fraudulent funds that they lost. Okay, so despite all the historical scandals that have happened, they're still happening today. So in 2016, this is Billy McFarland. He is the CEO of Fire Media, and he was trying to make this elaborate festival so that he could appeal to his investors that he was, had this awesome talent booking agency. Well, his festival was a big flop, and it's known as Fire Fraud, and he ended up repetitively misrepresenting Fire Media's finances so that supporters would put their money into it. But then he said he would make like millions of dollars in talent booking, but he really only made about like 60,000. So he ended up pleading guilty in 2018 for 2 counts of fraud and had to forfeit 26 million for wire fraud, and he was sentenced to 6 years in prison, and he's facing $100 million lawsuit. It doesn't seem major compared to the other 2 examples of Enron and Madoff, I'm sorry, but it goes to show like scandals aren't a thing of the past, and he's pretty young, so you can see like this could happen to any of you, so you have to be careful. Just to recap, it's just like don't do anything unethical because you will get caught, especially in a corporate setting. And I'm gonna pass it off to that, and who's gonna talk about generational influences.
Hi everyone, I'm Valerie. I'm a junior HR marketing major. Today I'm going to be talking about the generational influences on work behavior. So psychologist Kurt Lewin, known as the founder of psychology, created a well-known formula that states that the behavior is a function of the person and their environment. One powerful environmental influence that can be seen in organizations today is based on generational influences. Currently, 5 generations of workers coexist in many organizations. The backgrounds and behaviors create challenges for leading these individuals that often have similar shared experiences within their generation, but different sets of values, motivations, and traditionalists who were born between 1900 to 1945 currently make up less than 2% of the workforce and only 10% of the current population. Their numbers are small, but they have created like a lasting legacy within our businesses today. So they contributed, their contributions to the World War II gave them values of personal communication, loyalty, hierarchy, and resistance to change. The next generation is the baby boomers, who were born between the years of 1946 to 1964. They are considered the largest generation because they consist of 80 million people, and in 1964 they were 40% of the US population. They're very influential, and they have taken on leadership positions that support some of the world's most successful organizations. They continue to seek avenues to redefine and improve themselves and to bring the very best of themselves to the workplace. The next generation is Generation X. They were born between 1965 and 1976. They make up a small group of 60 million people, and they're considered as the forgotten generation because they're squeezed between two huge generations. They like flexibility in their jobs and don't like being micromanaged. They value independence and have brought this self-reliance with them into the workplace. They prefer to work alone and they don't get along with millennials because millennials like to work together. So they were born between 1977 and 1997. They have 82 million people in their generation, which is bigger than the baby boomers. As of right now, the youngest millennials are just graduating college and the oldest are in their mid 30s. So they're being groomed to leadership positions, and by 2020, they'll consist of 50% of the workforce. They bring them whole selves to work, and they are very collaborative and tech savvy. The last generation that has yet to really hit the workforce is Gen Edge, which consists of 61 million people. They're born between 1998 and 2010, and they're growing up on a literal cultural edge because they're going to be the last generation who will have a Caucasian majority. So my personal experience is that I worked at a company over the summer as an intern who was struggling with their generations clicking. So I had to form a employee engagement program to get all the generations to communicate with each other. So I created an ice cream social in the summer. It was really nice and it got all like everyone outside eating, talking, just relaxing and enjoying nice ice cream. So just to review everything, Gemma talked about what ethics were and how they act within your personal life and professional life. She gave very good examples. And then Emily introduced the 6 stages of moral development and the different levels within them. And then Madison talked about rational decision making. And then Danielle defined and gave examples of corporate scandals that have happened in the past and that are still currently happening. And then just to recap what I just talked about, I talked about all the different generations that are working currently together and their sets of values. And that's really it. So thank you.
Well done, everyone. Slide by. Turned off.
Thank you.